Since the mid-19th century, the great sea power, that is Britain, which I often refer to as the Atlanticist power bloc, has sought to conquer the great Eurasian landmass. At the time, this power bloc was made up of Britain and France, the two dominant imperial colonizers, which between them had conquered most of the global south. Following the defeat of Napoleon, France fell under British dominion and would become a reluctant but willing ally, fighting alongside rather than against each other, as had been the case for centuries between these two historic rivals. From the mid-1800s, they would join forces in most major wars until the present day. Anglo-liberalism had thoroughly transformed France, especially after the Revolution, making the French natural post-Enlightenment allies of the English, something that would have been unthinkable barely a century prior. France was a land power, which was clearly demonstrated under Napoleon. France was also a sea power, albeit not as significant as British naval power, but still the second most powerful in the world in the 19th century. This was reflected in their respective empires, which were both enormous. The French Empire was around 40% that of the British, which was still extremely vast, and is comparable to the difference in their respective naval strength. On land, however, the French were stronger, so they complemented each other and made for a lethal combination which allowed them to effectively dominate most of the world, apart from mainland Europe, and of course, Russia. This eastern colossus that held an enormous territory across the Eurasian landmass, full of natural resources, much to the envy of these two Western powers. With France effectively roped in to the British liberal imperium, the Atlanticist powers sought to defeat, subjugate, and colonize Russia. The 19th century was the period known as the Great Game between the Russian and the British empires. East versus West, land versus sea, liberal versus illiberal. The sea powers used blockade as their primary weapon, using bottlenecks and choke points, such as the Suez and the Malacca Straits, to strangle their opponents into submission. This is very effective against islands, coastal regions, and small to medium-sized peninsular territories. However, it doesn't work against entire continents, much less a landmass as gargantuan as Eurasia. But this is exactly what the Atlanticists attempted, and are still trying to achieve, even to this day. Russia was effectively surrounded by enemies, the Japanese in the Far East, the British to the south, the Ottomans to the southwest, and the Germanics to their west. The heartland of Central Asia was the prize that the British were most interested in, with Afghanistan as the flashpoint where these two empires collided. This was the furthest the British were ever able to advance into the Eurasian landmass. A naval power has the advantage of global reach, and with Britain as the uncontested sea power since the Battle of Trafalgar, they were unchallenged in the Atlantic, Indian, and much of the Pacific Oceans, effectively controlling all the sea lanes, and thus had authority over trade across most of the world. The historic land routes across Central Asia, which had been used by merchants for centuries, had been closed by the Ottomans. This forced Europeans to innovate and seek new ways of connecting with the Far East, beginning with the Iberians, and later the French, Dutch, and British, the latter asserting supremacy across the seas. Russia's size was both an advantage and a hindrance, too big to be conquered outright, but almost impossible to defend its long borders all at once. The inaccessible Arctic region protects the north. The Black Sea and the Caucasus protect parts of the south. However, the west is flat, open country with no natural defenses. The Great Eurasian Plain stretches from Germany all the way to Mongolia, allowing for invading armies to sweep across, as seen many times over the centuries. Only with the acquisition of firearms were the Russians finally able to stop these invasions from the east, such as the Huns, the Avars, and the Mongols. The first major conflict between Britain and Russia came in the 1850s at the Battle of Crimea, when a British-led coalition comprising of mainly French and Ottoman armies defeated the Russians, expelling them from the Black Sea. This war demonstrated how sea power defeats land power on coastlines where conditions are favorable and the proximity to the sea allows maritime powers to maximize their effectiveness, using their battleships to bombard the enemy. The Russians didn't make use of their main armies, and only employed a limited force to defend their territory along the Black Sea. They couldn't afford to leave other areas undefended, especially along their western border, in case the Austrians decided to attack. Losing Crimea was certainly a setback for the Russians, but not a total defeat. The 19th century was a multipolar world, dominated by regional powers, with the exception of Britain, which was the global hegemon, with extraordinary overreach through its navy, unmatched by any other power. Another unique feature of the British was their desire to conquer the entire world. All other powers, that is Russia, Japan, China, Ottoman Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and France, all had ambitions abroad, but these were mainly restricted to within their own geographical area and their immediate borders. None of these powers behaved like the British, who made global conquest their ultimate ambition. They understood this wasn't possible, but they were only thinking on conventional terms. The British, however, saw things differently. They also understood that conquering the world could not be done conventionally and exclusively with British military force. Britain was simply too small, with limited capacity and resources, both in men and material, even with their empire, which gave them access to almost unlimited resources. For this reason, coalitions were needed, fighting asymmetric warfare to outmaneuver enemies through deception, assassination, social engineering, creating political unrest, and striking militarily only under favorable conditions. In order to control the world, the Eurasian heartland had to be conquered first, and from there, a commanding position could be achieved. Eurasia, being the largest landmass, also hosts the most resources and number of people. Control of resources means control of populations. The obstacles presented to the British were enormous. Not only would this require all efforts from every angle of attack, as mentioned previously, but Eurasia is comprised of 5 major powers, all of whom would need to be defeated. Of course, fighting them all at once would not be possible, and so the British would make use of their deceptive tactics and vast wealth in order to convince these powers to fight each other, creating alliances with selected powers as and when needed. The strategy was to eliminate each of these powers one by one, dismantling Eurasia piecemeal. British foreign policy on continental Europe was always to side with the second power to offset the first power and ensure that no belligerent could outright control all of Europe and become the hegemon. This can be seen during the Napoleonic Wars, when France was the top European power, followed by the Crimean War against Russia, and of course, the 2 world wars against Germany. Taking down the most powerful opponent first is the logical and necessary step on the path to global rule. Although none of the powers mentioned were destroyed during the 19th century, the British certainly tried, waging asymmetric warfare against China, known as the Opium Wars, which was devastating. The Crimean War weakened Russia's position. The Ottoman Empire had been retracting for centuries and was already in decline. Austria-Hungary was benign, and France was subordinated, acting in Britain's interests, such as in the Franco-Prussianwar, which didn't go to plan, having the reverse effect, resulting in an immensely powerful and unified Germanic state dominating Europe along with Austria-Hungary, forming a new power bloc, known as the Central Powers, which presented Britain with a new and far greater threat to their position as global hegemon. The British could dominate and contain China, Russia, Austria, and the Ottomans, none of which were expansionist beyond their own immediate vicinity. Also, there was enough distance between Great Britain and these political rivals to avoid an all-out war. But Germany was right there, across the North Sea, with a powerful industrial base, an unbeatable land army, and a growing fleet of battleships that could challenge the Royal Navy. Furthermore, Germany was building its own empire with overseas colonies from Africa to New Guinea. That being said, Germany was not a threat insofar as Britain's own security at home and overseas. The Germans never had any plans to invade Britain or attempt to dispossess London of any of its foreign assets. Germany's mere existence, and more importantly, its trade policies, is what Britain feared most. Their products were of better quality, their industry was outpacing that of Britain's, and Germany was simply outcompeting them. This new perceived threat, following the crushing of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, refocused London's foreign policy away from Russia and onto the Central Powers. The emergence of Germany changed the geopolitical landscape. Germany was clearly the most powerful side on the entire Eurasian landmass. Whatever happened, the British could absolutely not allow Berlin and Moscow to form an alliance and cooperate, as this would spell the end of any hopes of keeping Eurasia divided, which was the best London could do short of conquering this ocean of land. If Russia and Germany became allies, or entered into some kind of partnership, then the other land powers would be under their influence, leaving Britain isolated and on the fringes, having to settle with its existing holdings, unable to expand into new territories. London's central banking system demanded never-ending growth, which meant the government was constantly searching for more resources in order to service its debts, plundering the global south, and extracting natural resources, creating a military-industrial economy to conquer, exploit, and expand, which required even greater military power in order to maintain this cycle. Thus, Britain was a feedback loop of colonization and war. Colonies needed military enforcement, which required colonies to mine and extract the resources needed to build the weapons of war. The British Empire had become a Frankenstein with an appetite that could never be satisfied. In other words, Britain was literally out of control. Sound familiar? Britain and France were limited in their capacity for confronting other major powers. Although they defeated the Russians in Crimea, it was localized and came at a huge cost. They never confronted Russia head-on again. By the turn of the century, Anglo-French power was in decline, having exerted much effort expanding into new colonies in Africa and fighting wars. And with the rise of the Central Powers in Europe, it seemed the Atlanticists were on their way out, except they had an ace up their sleeve. The British were reining in their settler colonies, that is, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada, but they were also seeking to bring back their former colony, which had grown into its own regional power. Cecil Rhodes and his clique of elites knew that if they could bring the USA back into the empire and under their control, it would give them a renewed shot at world conquest. But first, they had to solve the German question. They had already maneuvered their pawns into place, chiefly Russia and France, which they knew were absolutely vital in order to defeat Germany and Austria. The swift crushing of France by the Germans 30 years earlier had shocked all major powers and proved how effective the German military really was, which had also defeated the Austrians, another major player, just a few years earlier. Germany was not going to be an easy opponent and would require all the major powers to participate in a coordinated effort. Despite the large Russian armies, there were doubts that even with the combined forces of France, Britain, and Russia, Germany could not be defeated, and so they needed assistance from Washington. If Germany could be conquered and subjugated, this would pinch off Central Europe from Eurasia, bringing it under Atlanticist control, allowing for pressure to be applied to Russia's western frontier. The fact that Russia sided with Britain and France against the Central Powers in World War I proves how effective the British were at negotiating. Less than 60 years earlier, they had attacked, defeated, and humiliated Russia on its own doorstep. Although Austria and Russia had tense relations, Germany had never attacked or posed any threat to Russia, and yet the Russians had been convinced by the British deep state to mobilize in a blatant act of war against Germany. Using carefully placed agents in key positions, using bribes, blackmail, and assassinations, British spies and foreign ministers managed to manipulate the Russian state into going to war with devastating consequences. The Great War of 1914 to 1945 was a victory for the Atlanticists. They destroyed their most powerful competitor, albeit using the Soviet Union, which they helped create, with the exportation of Marxism to do their dirty work, fighting on their behalf, as they very cynically and cleverly maneuvered these two giant land powers of Eurasia into history's most destructive war, in a classic divide-and-conquer move. They say, if you can't beat them, join them. But for the Anglo-American bloc, which as a sea power could never defeat Germany or Russia, their motto was different. If you can't beat them, get them to beat each other. Then when no one's left, walk through the ashes, plant a flag, and claim victory. Not only had they removed their most feared opponent, the Atlanticist power bloc had taken control of Western Europe, including the most important half of Germany and its industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. Germany's primary resource is not some raw material that can be extracted from the ground. Their most valuable asset is their manpower. German labor is a priceless resource that can't be found or replicated anywhere else, as Germans only come from Germany. The Anglo-American powers now controlled this, adding it to their inventory as West Germany became part of their bloc. The Atlanticist powers may have come out stronger after World War II, but so too did the Soviet Union, which now controlled all of Eastern and much of Central Europe, meaning the battle for Eurasia would continue. The world was now split between two superpowers, the Soviet bloc and the Atlanticist bloc, both possessing nuclear weapons, which kept them from engaging in direct confrontations. However, the Anglo-Americans didn't give up on their goal of conquering the heartland. They'd already managed to take down a superpower, so what could stop them from repeating this? But more importantly, they'd never really been defeated. Therefore, they had no incentive to stop, or even understood their own limits, learning all the wrong lessons in World War II, where they piggybacked a victory from the Russians. Throughout the Cold War, the Atlanticists made tireless attempts at weakening the Soviet Union through proxy wars, espionage, creating insurgencies, and propaganda. Direct war was not an option, even without nukes, so they maintained the same strategy of instigating conflicts amongst their enemies, something the British had been doing since the Napoleonic Wars, and even before. The only problem was, there weren't enough enemies, at least ones that were significant enough to confront the USSR. Japan had been destroyed and absorbed into the Western sphere of influence. Turkey was no longer a major power, and China, although large, was not willing to go to war with the Soviets, despite a conflict nearly breaking out in the 1960s when tensions between Moscow and Beijing were high. This of course was beneficial to the Anglo powers, as it kept Eurasia necessarily divided, according to the Mackinder theory. But ultimately, it was simply not possible to wage an all-out shooting war against the USSR, and instead the West used other means to chip away at their nemesis, including economic warfare. In 1974, Washington and Saudi Arabia entered into an agreement that oil would only be sold in US dollars, a brilliant move and one of the main factors leading to the demise of the Soviet bloc, which simply could no longer compete. The primary goal of the Anglo-American bloc is to control Eurasia, not only for world domination, as it would put them in a commanding position, but also to acquire the unlimited amounts of natural resources. However, actually invading and conquering this ocean of land is not possible, certainly not as a sea power. Thus, the secondary goal is to somehow commandeer the powers that do hold Eurasia, and the heartland, in order to then extract the vast deposits of resources by proxy. As seen in post-colonial Africa, if all these states across Eurasia can be infiltrated and made into client regimes, then it's mission accomplished. This nearly happened at the conclusion of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The old Soviet flags hadn't even been replaced when Anglo-American oligarchs flooded into Russia, seizing control of commodity extraction in a feeding frenzy as these capitalist vultures looted the carcass of this once mighty superpower. The pillaging didn't last long, however, but many got very rich very quickly, as Russia became a lawless mafia state with a Washington stooge in the Kremlin, allowing his country to be robbed blind. Russia is not Africa or India. It's simply impossible to colonize. The Atlanticists may have had a couple years of free-for-all when they were able to fill their boots, but that was an anomaly, and by the year 2000, the party was over. The Russians know too well how to stare defeat in the face, only to emerge victorious. The Anglo-American powers may lack rationality, logic, and sanity, but one thing they don't lack is tenacity. They simply do not give up, ever. As Putin put Russia back together, expelling the foreign exploiters, DC infiltrated, armed, and propagandized the Ukraine for the purpose of a direct frontal assault on what they perceived to be a weakened Russia that could be broken into pieces, finally opening up the heartland for colonization. This proxy war in Ukraine is the last throw of the dice. The Atlanticists have gambled everything in this final battle for the Eurasian continent. Once the Ukrainian army collapses, it will mark the end of a 200-year struggle between Anglo sea power and Russian land power, as the former has finally exhausted itself. There is no superpower they can draw on, as was done in both world wars. The collective West is a spent force. A tsunami may be able to devastate a land, even many miles from the coast, but it always recedes as it is forced back into the ocean by nature. The age of sea power is coming to a conclusion. The Atlanticists tried everything for 2 centuries, but Eurasia is simply too large, with populations that refuse to be conquered or become vassals. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please consider subscribing. Please also share and leave a like. It's free and it helps the channel. Also, a big thank you to all of you who have very kindly donated. I very much appreciate your generosity, as this channel is demonetized. For one-off donations, it's easy. I accept PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee, or even crypto. Links are in the description. Until next time.